Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with West Virginia Democrat Senator Joe Manchin. Senator, what did you make of the health care bill that passed out of the House?
I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't from this standpoint. We are a state, as I mentioned before, that's done a lot of heavy work for this country, heavy lifting for over 100 years. We have a lot of pre-existing conditions. I have a lot of people that are elderly. Every dynamic and every topography of my state gets absolutely slammed with this piece of legislation. So I said, get rid of the word repeal and start talking about repairing. If they can get rid of the word repeal, John, we can sit down. Democrats and Republicans could work through this. We know that this bill needs to be fixed. The Affordable Care Act, there's not a Democrat doesn't realize we need to work on the private market. But you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and you're throwing insult to injury by giving $575 billion tax cut to the wealthiest Americans while you're cutting $880 billion of service to the poorest of Americans. If you want more synergies there, you know, I said this before, John, we have given 20 million people health care they never had, never bought, don't know the value. We never gave them one word of instructions how to use it more effectively, how to use it more efficiently, how to keep themselves healthier, nutritional lifestyles, changing their whole lifestyles, making them more accountable and responsible. There's tremendous savings. We're not trying anything. We're just throwing the baby out with the bathwater in order to give a tax break. I just want to work and sit down and try to get something done, but no one's asked us. I understand that we have 13 Republican senators working on revamping the bill. Our congressional delegation says, don't worry, the Senate will fix it. And no one's asked any Democrat. And I'm the most centrist Democrat willing to work and fix things if people really want to do it. But I can't do it with a threat of shut down, repeal, throw it out.
I want to move on quickly, Senator, to the Intelligence Committee, which you sit on. You've gotten some more information. The CIA has given some briefings. Is there, what's your view on any proof? Have you seen anything that suggests any collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign?
Well, there's an awful lot of smoke there, let's put it that way. People that might have said they were involved, to what extent they were involved, to what extent the president might have known about these people or whatever. There's nothing there from that standpoint that we have seen directly linking our president to any of that. But with the other thing being said, there's an awful lot of people surrounding that, whether it be Mike Flynn, Carter Page, Manafort, all these people of high interest. We're going to find out. This is going to be done. And the Senate, as I said before, is the workhorse of this operation, the Senate Intelligence Committee. When Carter Page says he wants to basically be cooperating, and then all of a sudden we get another strange message saying, well, if you want to know what's going on, check with the Obama or President Obama or his administration. That's not the way to conduct a thorough investigation, to get to the bottom, to see if you had any concerns that we might have of your involvement with the Russians. We know the Russians did everything they could to be involved in our campaign. We know that what they're doing around the world right now, whether it be in France or other parts of the world, they'll do anything they can to disrupt any type of a freedom, if you will, or a democracy, or an involvement where there's an orderly transfer of power. That's not for them. Right. They're going to do what they can. We got to make sure we stop it.
All right, Senator Manchin, thank you so much for being with us. And joining us now is former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. She's got a new book out. It's titled Democracy: Stories from the Long Road to Freedom. Welcome, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
Very good to have you here.
Great to be with you.
Senator Manchin and I were just talking about Russia, so I'll start there with the question to you, which is, help Americans who've heard all the political talk of Russia. How should Americans think about Russia and America's national security interests?
Well, we have to think about Russia in terms of the last several years under Vladimir Putin. And I think what we're seeing is a president of Russia who has established authoritarianism at home and assertiveness and aggressiveness abroad. He really believes that he is re-establishing Russian greatness, that he has Russia back in the game. But the most important thing is that he hasn't seemed to respect certain lines in doing that. And the most important thing is to reestablish that the United States is going to defend its allies in NATO under Article 5, an attack upon one is an attack upon all, that the United States will not countenance the Russian military threatening our forces by flying very close to our ships or to our planes. I think rebuilding the defense budget has helped to send that signal. And by the way, the strike in Syria has helped to send the signal that the United States is going to get leverage back in the Middle East. And so this is a dangerous time with the Russians, but it could also be, once we've established the ground rules, there are many things we need to cooperate with the Russians on, including, by the way, the most vexing problem of North Korea, where they too can't be too comforted by a reckless North Korean leader with missiles and nuclear weapons that can reach Russia as well as eventually the United States.
I want to get to North Korea in a second, but you write in your book about Russia being a tide that has gone deep into Europe when it's powerful and receded when it's weak. Where is America in terms of breaking that tide? I mean, is it halfway there, quarter of the way there?
Well, we've always hoped that the Russians would see their role in the world as one built on the respect that comes from economic power, from soft power. But unfortunately, it's turned to military power again to establish itself. And I do think that we've begun to say to the Russians, for instance, what President Obama did to put rotating forces in the Baltic states and in Poland. That was a good message to the Russians that certain things are not acceptable. The strike in Syria was a good message, but we need to continue to send strong messages about Ukraine and other places that we're not going to countenance a Russia that is aggressive against allies and states that shouldn't be threatened by their neighbors.
On North Korea, what should America not countenance? What is the tipping point for?
Well, a lot has happened, John, in the last several years. This is now a different regime than even under Kim Jong-il, the father. Kim Jong-un is reckless, maybe even a bit unstable. He has made improvements in his nuclear capabilities that look as if he's getting closer to a deliverable nuclear weapon, and perhaps in, I don't know what they're telling the president because I don't have the intelligence, but 3-5 years, the ability to reach the United States, that cannot be countenanced by any American president. I don't care who's in the White House. In order to deal with that, you have to change the Chinese calculus, and I think that's what the administration's trying to do. They've worried most about the collapse of the regime and their long border and instability on their border. But you have to say to them, even if you have to take very tough steps that might ultimately collapse the regime, you have to take steps because we will if you don't. And I think that's the message that you're starting to see.
In your book, you are making the case for democracy. We have a president who talks about America first. We have a lot of Americans who are wary of U.S. entanglements overseas. Make the case for democracy to those who would be in the more, hey, let's just not fuss with the overseas stuff.
Well, the first thing is to remember what democracy promotion is not. It is not what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were security issues that we felt we had to solve. And then we said, once we've overthrown those dictators, we need to give those people a chance toward democracy. But most of democracy promotion is really about supporting those within their countries that want to have the simple freedoms that we have, the right to say what you think, to worship as you please, to be free from the knock of the secret police at night, places like Liberia and Ukraine and other places that are trying to get there. Now, Americans should recognize that of course we're going to defend our interests. But in the long run, our interests are better served when we have democracies that don't hire child soldiers, that don't harbor terrorists as a matter of state policy, that don't traffic in human beings, that don't start wars with one another. The quintessential example of this is that we took a risk after World War II that a democratic Germany would never threaten its neighbors, that democratic Japan would never threaten its neighbors. And now, not only have they not threatened their neighbors, they are firm allies and they are pillars of international stability. Democracy takes time. One of the points that I make in the book is it took us a long time. That first American Constitution counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man. That first American Constitution didn't provide my father the right to vote in 1952 in Birmingham, Alabama. But I took an oath of allegiance to that same Constitution as a black woman Secretary of State with a Jewish woman Supreme Court Justice swearing me in. Democracy takes time, and we have to be a little bit more patient and a little bit more helpful and speaking out for those who are still trying to get there.
Well, let me ask you about that, because President Trump, whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or el-Sisi in Egypt or Putin in Russia, the sound of freedom does not seem to come often in conversations with him. Is there a cost from that?
Well, I think it's early in the administration. There's something about the presidency that you recognize over time tremendous, not just responsibility, but the weight that it carries. And of course we're going to have to deal with the president of Egypt. Of course we're going to have to deal with the president of Turkey. But it's well to remember, too, that our interest and our values suggests that when countries that we have good relations with and want good relations with actually reform before there are revolutions, our interests are served, too. And I think that if the United States, democracy promotion actually is very often not very expensive. It's supporting elections, supporting the building of civil society, supporting a free press abroad. So I have no problem with the president meeting with those leaders. He has to. But we always need to speak for our values as well. And our values are the belief that we were endowed with certain rights by our Creator. It can't be true for just us and not for them.
Final question is this president, like all presidents, is bristling against the constraints of democracy that you write a lot about in here. That has caused him to say critical things of the judiciary, of the press, and of Congress and the pace with which they work. How does that play for other countries that say, you see, you've got a messiness over there, don't come tell us about how to do this?
Well, there's no doubt that presidents get to be president and then they realize that the founding fathers put all kinds of constraints on the presidency, a Congress, courts, civil society, a press, not to mention Americans who are kind of ungovernable anyway. And it can be frustrating. But I think that when I talk to others who are making that, I say it's also safest when the executive is actually constrained. That's what the founding fathers understood. They also understood that democracies are not perfect. We are imperfect, but our message to the world, in many ways our best message to the world, is that you just get up every day and you keep working to overcome those imperfections. And when you do that, you get a chance to enjoy these amazing liberties. And so I'm very grateful to the founding fathers for having given us these institutions. I hope we can encourage others to have the same.
All right, Secretary Rice, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with our political panel. We turn now to our political panel. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief of USA Today. Michael Gerson is a columnist at the Washington Post. Nancy Cordes is a CBS News chief congressional correspondent. And Jamelle Bouie is a CBS News political analyst and Slate Magazine's chief political correspondent. Michael Gerson, I want to start with you quickly, picking up on Condoleezza Rice, with whom you worked. The threat to democracy all over the world now is a big story, and it's taking place in France as there's an election today.
Yeah, it's true. And American policy in Europe, for example, has been democracy and unity for 7 decades. There's a reason for that. Because in every country you have a conflict between identity and idealism, between kind of blood and soil nationalism and transnational ideals. And in the 20th century, all the worst events of the 20th century took place because of the triumph of identity over idealism in Europe. So I think there's a very direct interest that everybody has in the outcome of these kind of debates.
What are you watching, Jamelle, in the outcome of the French election that Americans might care about?
I'm watching to see how well the National Front and Le Pen do in today's elections. I think the conventional wisdom right now is that the National Front will end up falling short of winning the election. But getting to the second round, its share of the vote, those are actually very significant events for French political history, and it'll be a sign, perhaps, of currents in French politics and in European politics, whether Le Pen does, as the polls suggest, or better.
Power of that nationalism Michael was talking about. Susan Page, back here in America, health care. The winners and the losers from the House success.
So big winners, I think, Paul Ryan and Donald Trump. Big losers, Paul Ryan and Donald Trump. What would we be saying this morning if they had failed to get this through the House? It would be devastating politically. But when you get to the substance, they now own the American healthcare system. And you heard the budget director and other administration officials and the president making promises they will not be able to keep, that everyone will be covered, that premiums will go down, that deductibles will go down, that people with pre-existing conditions will not lose any of their protections. That combination of things cannot happen.
Nancy, it came together fast, it felt like, at the end. Give us a sense of what the process tells us about where things stand.
Well, they had to strike when the iron was hot. They couldn't let their members go once they thought that they had the magic number. So you first had this compromise between a moderate member and conservative members that seemed to bring a lot of the Freedom Caucus on board, but left a lot of moderates steaming mad. They felt that some of those protections that Susan just talked about had been eroded. Along comes Fred Upton with yet another amendment that puts a little more money into pre-existing conditions, and that gave some political cover to these moderates who felt that the bill was never going to be perfect in the House, but they just needed to get it out of the House, get it to the Senate, to fulfill a big promise that they've been making for the past 7 years, which was that they were going to repeal Obamacare.
Michael, what did you make of that ceremony in the Rose Garden? You know from White House ceremonies. What did you make of it?
Well, I think it's a victory dance on the 50-yard line, and I think when you do that, it's not a sign of strength. It's actually a kind of pathetic desire for praise. So I think that was premature, and this House is really relying on the Senate to come through here. They put out something that did meet all of those standards of the members, but was not coherent in the end. I think, depending on the Senate led by Senator Alexander, to provide some coherence in the Republican approach.
Now, there are plenty of hurdles among Republicans in the Senate. This is a Republican show over there. What are the hurdles?
The hurdles are Medicaid, right? That quite a few Republican senators want to preserve some measure of Medicaid coverage, the Medicaid expansion. During recess earlier in the year, there were many angry town halls involving constituents who wanted to preserve those Medicaid expansion. And the House bill cuts hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid, and although the budget director suggested that there would not be any coverage losses as a result of those cuts, the plain fact is that, in fact, many people will lose coverage as a result of those Medicaid cuts. So one major hurdle is what the Senate is going to do about Medicaid, and how will Senate Republicans deal with the fact that many of them come from states where large numbers of constituents have picked up coverage from the Medicaid expansion.
And there's a hurdle that's just plain logistical, which is the fact that Republicans can only afford to lose two of their members in the Senate. And it's very hard at this point to envision a bill that would satisfy Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. Both Susan Collins and Rand Paul said this week the House bill is dead, but for completely different reasons. He thinks it leaves too much of Obamacare intact. She thinks it takes too much of Obamacare away. How does the Senate craft a bill that satisfies these two wings of the party when you have this incredibly small margin of error?
But of course, we should remember that Democrats face big divides when they pass the Affordable Care Act as well. And when you deal with something that's as big and complicated as the American healthcare system, you're going to end up with people accepting things that they start out thinking are unacceptable. The thing that Republicans have going for them is that they've been made this promise for 7 years, as you said, and there is a big impetus to deliver on them. Now, I don't know if they'll be able to deliver on or not, but there are going to be huge consequences for either delivering or not delivering on them, and that may be the best argument that Republicans have going forward.
Michael, what do you make of the president? His signature talent, he said he would come to Washington and be a negotiator of a kind no one had ever seen before. Assess his negotiating in this case, but also in what he's got to do in the Senate process.
Well, it was a unique view of the presidential role. Usually a president will come in with some of his own ideas and try to sell a bunch of people in the Congress on them. He did not do that in this case. All he wanted was a bill passed. The goal was something, not something with these parameters. And so I think that is very different than presidents have done in the past.
Jamil, Democrats are running ads now, but attacking Republicans. They raised a lot of money. Sort through the politics. Are they right, or are they a little premature here?
I don't think they're too premature. If the American Health Care Act passes in its current form, if it becomes law in its current form, which likely isn't going to happen, let's say, well, what the House voted for. All of a sudden, millions of Americans will once again be open to a scenario where their insurers charge sort of impossibly higher rates for pre-existing conditions. And so while it might be technically true that the bill doesn't deny anyone coverage on the basis of pre-existing conditions, it is certainly true that people will certainly no longer be able to afford their coverage. And that is a very potent attack line. I want to quickly go to something Susan said. It's totally true that during the Affordable Care Act fight, there are these big divisions among Democrats. about how much they were going to spend for coverage, so on and so forth. But there was one unifying principle, and basically everyone in the Democratic Party agreed that the government had some fundamental responsibility to the public for health insurance. And that agreement doesn't exist among Republicans, and I think that's the sticking point. And it's a tough thing to get around.
That if this is passed in its current form, there'll be these political problems for Republicans. The Republicans who voted for this in the House can have ads run against them on the basis of this vote, even if this plan goes nowhere. Right. And we know that there are, 23 seats held by Republicans in districts that Hillary Clinton carried. Those are going to be the prime targets for the next 18 months.
And the interesting thing about these ads isn't just the damage that they could do in advance of 2018, which is still 18 months away, but they're also to send a message to Senate Republicans. Look at the kind of heat that you're going to get if you put together a bill that hurts Medicaid, that hurts people with pre-existing conditions. There are 24 House Republicans who are going to start facing those ads tomorrow, and even more facing radio ads in California. This is designed to, to pave the way for 2018, but even more so right now to send a message to Senate Republicans who are getting to work.
In an odd way, this is the victory of President Obama. I think he has ingrained expectations in the American public about pre-existing conditions, about universal coverage, and about cost, affordable cost, that are not going to be met by Republicans in this case. They were not really met by Obamacare either, where you had higher premiums and higher deductibles at the same time for a lot of people. These expectations are now ingrained, and you wonder what's the road that doesn't keep us from going to single payer eventually, because given those assumptions.
And that's really interesting, because for a lot of liberal Democrats and for a lot of Democrats on the left, Obamacare was a very flawed compromise. It was sort of this middling path that they took because that's what they thought they had to do to get something approaching universal coverage. And it's clear that the Republican Party will never accept any kind of compromise on this. And so I think for the Democratic left, there's a new argument, right, that next time we have power, why not go for Medicare for all? What are the practical reasons not to do it? What are the political reasons not to do it? And looking at how House Republicans got this bill through, why do we have to go through all the rigmarole that we did last time if the Republicans didn't? And so I think the GOP has opened itself up to perhaps a backlash that it might not be anticipating policy-wise.
Nancy, the Freedom Caucus, the conservatives in the House, fought and got what they wanted for this House bill. The Senate bill is going to come back to them, maybe. Right. Why are they going to agree to a bill that's gotten more moderate when it went over to the Senate?
There's, no guarantee that they will. I think that the Senate is going to have to make a calculation at some point. Who are we trying to win over with this bill in the House? Is it going to be the Freedom Caucus, or is it going to be the GOP moderates? They can afford to lose members of one group, but probably not both. And so, that's going to be part of the political process here. Not only how do we win over Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, or Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, and probably at some point they're going to have to go in a direction that's going to make one of those two wings unhappy, and it's going to play out the same way in the House.
All right, we're going to have to go in a direction towards the commercial. So thanks to all of you, and we'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Next week, we'll hear from former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.